Very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and whatever time zone one is logging in. A very warm jab him to everybody. My name is Suraj Yengde, and this lecture series, that is today is the 8th of the 10 previous sessions that we had with the incredible scintillating conversations, lectures given by Dr. Geetha, who is logging in from Tamil Nadu. Today we have yet another topic, which is a part two of what we had inaugurated uh, on Monday. And I think today, with the readings that I had opportunity to go through, one of the recurring theme is democracy, and in extension, parliamentary democracy. Ambedkar is very secular when he understands democracy, and secular not in the sense of religious atonements, but secular in the sense of his liberal approach of democracy. He is very revolutionary in thinking about democracy, where he thinks about revolutionary changes in the social and economic life of people brought without bloodshed. And I think this revolutionary, bloodless democracy that Ambedkar is envisioning, Ambedkar brings out in his two lectures, one is in 1952 and one is in 1951, that we had opportunity to read today. In those two conversations that Ambedkar put forward, we have to always put that in context of history. He had just submitted his constitution. Elections are coming. Congress is another behemoth trying to overpower everything. And it is in this light Ambedkar is emphasizing democracy. Democracy needs opposition, an effective opposition to function. And he gives examples of Canada and England, where opposition leaders are honored and they are paid, because that's an essential part of democracy. Ambedkar keeps on drawing from democratic legacies of the Athenian democracy of the Greece, where he discards that because that democracy cannot be ideal right now, because 50% of them were slaves. Some will argue more than 50%. But again, that's how the lineage of democracy comes to it. Then America is very much a center of focus. England is focus. And of course, the other democratic countries like Canada and Australia too. Ambedkar, in addition to opposition, is talking about the malintentions of big businesses and their involvement in running a democracy. And then he says big businesses it comes at the peril of exercising a free democratic practice. In addition to his suspicion over big businesses, Ambedkar is also very much concerned about the media, who is playing the lapdog with the government. And he says, because they are relying on government's revenue, that they even ridicule opposition and write columns always in favor of the government. In that spirit, Ambedkar is also talking about an independent administration, which is without influence of the minister or the government. And because he says an independent administration is something that is requiring for the effective functioning of democracy, if we lose that, then we lose the moral. And at the end, he gives a caveat during 1952 that such administration is again subduing to the rights of the ruling class, the ruling government. It is in this spirit, finally, Ambedkar is trying to make and put an emphasis on the morality of any form of democracy. One is constitutional morality, and another is morality in its practice, in its ethic. And this ethical morality in practice of government is very much coming from one of his kind of inspiration, Harold Lasky, who had emphasized on the definition of ethics as to be an ingredient of a democratic life and democratic ethos. Finally, Ambedkar, when he is engaging with democracy, he is saying democracy cannot be hereditary powers. What we see in Indian democracy, that is very antithesis of what Ambedkar was proposing when it comes to hereditary power. And there, where he gives examples of George Washington, who had refused to contest for the second term. As we all know, George Washington was the first term president, and second term, upon too much force, he took the second term, and then he said, I refuse. And that tradition has been continuing in American democratic experience. But in this case, what we see is democracy as a hereditary form continues to operate, continues to be manipulated in its own vicious form. And that's why it says democracy gives veto to power, which is the people. And I think this is a very socio-economic sense of political democracy that Ambedkar is proposing. It is in this spirit. Let's welcome Dr. Geetha who will again fire us up for the next 40 minutes-ish, and then we'll open up for questions. Over to you, Geetha.
Thank you, Suraj, and thanks for taking us through the writings. It always helps to remind ourselves that we are talking in very specific terms, while we are, of course, gesturing towards Ambedkar's larger worldview and his thought world. So, as always, I want to sort of start with a very quick refreshing of what we discussed last time. And one of the things, of course, that we saw was Ambedkar's understanding of the caste order and untouchability. What happens when you bring that understanding to bear on issues to do with labor and with the world of economics? And we saw how Ambedkar understood labor itself in the Indian context, where you have this fundamental division between mental and manual labor. Mental labor is valorized, manual labor is not seen as either based on skill or as based on an intelligence that the worker possesses. In that sense, labor does not secrete value as far as the Indian social order is concerned. And within the labor process, you have stigmatized professions, and those who are already in stigmatized professions cannot hope to access except through struggle, and how workers themselves are divided. As Ambedkar famously put it in The Annihilation of Caste, caste is not just a division of labor, it's a division of laborers, and that you cannot expect to evolve a proletarian consciousness without addressing all those that constitute the self of the proletarian, which of course in our context includes caste, a sense of being part of a caste, and a sense of religious belief and custom. What in an earlier lecture I brought in Ambedkar's use of the word mental habitude, which is based on religious customs and habits. So Ambedkar's sense of labor was fairly distinctive and different from what you usually find in standard left formulations during this period. Ambedkar's understanding of the economic life of the Indian social order was also distinctive, that because you are born into certain forms and relationships of production, because as Dr. Balgopal used to put it, caste is a production relationship, you may be stuck with professions that you don't wish to pursue. And that produces a certain sort of alienation, makes for economic inefficiency. So in every which way that you see, a caste-defined socio-economic order is something that one needs to understand in its specific nature and understand the sort of production that happens here, the kinds of production relationships that emerge out of that production process. So this is the sort of stuff that we went through. And we also saw that Ambedkar, in the trade union camp lecture that he gives, he talks of how there is no economic man, within quotes, in the Indian context yet. And I think what he means is, and he refers to this in other addresses to the working class as well, that we don't have a sense of the worker being part of a productive process and of adding and producing value. So the worker does not have a sense of his or her own productive capacity. And that's also something that's very important, because unless you see yourself as contributing to the production of goods, services, and of enhancing the economic life of the country, where is the possibility of a proletarian consciousness that can then move from, what in classic Marxist terms is from being a class in itself to a class for itself? So how is that likely to happen? That's the extended question that I suppose he wanted us to address. Maybe not in those terms, but he certainly put that question out there. And this is some of the stuff that we saw. And I just want to go back to some previous things I've been saying, that in Ambedkar's understanding, class was not simply a production relationship in the sense socialists understand it. He also uses it in a Weberian sense, in the sense that Max Weber uses it, class as estate or class as varna in the Indian context, which is why he also wants us to see that we also had our own forms of class struggle, whether it was Brahmins versus Kshatriyas or Brahmins and Kshatriyas versus the Vaishyas and Shudras. And I think, and the Kshatriyas amongst themselves, when they siphoned off a section and then degraded them as Shudras. So I think Ambedkar wants us to see that there was a distinctive form of class struggle in the ancient Indian past, which had to do with social supremacy. And I'll come back to that question again in a minute, but I just want to put all these things out there so that when we go back to look at Ambedkar's understanding of the economy in historical terms, his understanding of class, his understanding of what did he see a left formation could potentially do in India, and what is it actually doing? So all these questions then therefore become important. So that's by way of a background. So I want to start with how did he understand the economy, and how did he understand the movement within the economy, the historical movement within the economy. I think these are important questions to ask since we are concerned about class politics. I think Ambedkar's understanding of the economy that he came into, which is of course a colonial economy, if you look at his early writings, especially his student dissertations, provincial finance, the monetarist dissertation he wrote while at the London School of Economics to do with the gold and silver standards. So very clearly he sees the colonial economy as an extractive economy, as based on what we might call in Marxist terms primitive accumulation and extraction through very high revenue rates, and an immiseration of the artisanal populations, the indebtedness of the peasant and the agricultural laborer. These are all themes that he works through in his student dissertations. And he does draw on fairly well-known Indian theories of economics at that time, Dadabhai Naoroji, M.G. Ranade, all of whom stipulated that the Britain was causing a drain of wealth from India, and that this drain of wealth was adversely affecting Indian economic life, that the peasant economy was in crisis, that indebtedness was very high, that the revenues from the land were far higher to any sort of productivity you can expect from the land, and that an emergent mercantile capitalist class was producing goods, but in ways that supported the market in England rather than providing incentives for industrial growth in India. So it was these were the arguments that were part of the Indian nationalist economics circles. And Ambedkar did accept and agree with almost all of those. What he did was he questioned, or he sort of interrogated the relationship between economics and politics. What sort of political structure had the colonial government evolved to keep this economic structure in place? Was there any room for maneuverability within the political structure that could make the colonial government more accountable to peasants, to artisans, to agricultural laborers? And this again is a theme that you find in the writings of M.G. Ranade, in Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and the great doyens of economic thought in Maharashtra, down to D.V. Gadgil, all of whom, interestingly, in contrary to laissez-faire politics, contrary to classic capitalist understanding of the economy, envisaged a role for the state, especially for the colonial state at that time, and felt that the state should intervene and look at the betterment of the poorest of its populations. Now, why did they imagine the colonial state would have an investment? And that is another question. But I think they also understood that one aspect of the colonial state was the moral aspect. The British defined their own rule as being sort of morally better for India, that they were bearing the white man's burden to bring India into modern life. So I think using that, this first generation of economists looked to the colonial state to partially reform itself. That it did not reform itself in fundamental terms is a different matter, but the state was a point of address. And this is important for us to keep in mind, because from the very beginning, the nationalist economic school did not think that the free market should have its way in the Indian context, and that it did envisage a role for the state. Now, Ambedkar would, of course, build on this in a very, very profound way and move away from it, in that he did not just see a role for the state, he saw the state as having the potential to becoming a laborer state, a worker state at some point. So, this is something that Ambedkar does in the course of his journey, intellectual and political journey. And as I said in the last class, after the 1930s, his understanding of the economy grew increasingly radical, and what ought to be done with the economy, therefore also became far more exploratory in a radical sense. And I, of course, I'm still not sure what you would call that radical direction that he pursued, whether you would call it socialist, because socialism plus a project for the annihilation of caste is still a new creature. What would that creature look like? What would that project look like? And we may satisfy ourselves by saying it's anti-caste politics but plus socialism, but it's not as simple as Lal Salam plus Jai Bhim. I think conceptually it calls on us to imagine a radical thought world that would combine these two things in a very profound measure. And I think Ambedkar saw this task as something that hasn't fully begun in the Indian context. He saw himself as inaugurating that thought world. Let's not forget that the book that he intended to finish, but which he never did, India and the Prerequisites of Communism. So the word prerequisites is very important because he did feel that there was a preparedness, at least in the world of ideas, in the world of thought that had to take place, not unlike the sort of philosophical revolution that Marx viewed himself as having undertook, standing Hegel on his head, so to speak. And I think for Ambedkar, something of a similar nature within the Indian thought systems had to be carried out, which was very important for us to render the socialist project politically, ethically, and, and in terms of social relationships, a viable political project. Which is why in several of his writings, he kept saying, if Marx was here, he would have done this. If Lenin was here, he would have attended to the annihilation of caste. And interestingly, this is something that Periyar also says. He says, if Marx or Lenin were here, they would have been acquainted with Brahmanism, or acquainted themselves with the logic of Brahmanism. They would have understood that this whole edifice of caste and religion, and this is Periyar's metaphor, stands like a fort guarding the ramparts of greed and capital and extraction. And this is an interesting metaphor because when you go back to someone like Gramsci, who when he's discussing the war of movement and the war of position, which is the war of movement is a frontal attack against capitalism and the state, and the war of position is what he expects will have to take place in bourgeois democracies, where you have to entrench yourself and then fight a war continuously till the situation lends itself to a war of movement. And the war of position, when Gramsci talks about it, he also uses the metaphor of the fort. So I think there's a sense that one cannot talk of economic interests without at the same time looking at all those other things within social, political, and cultural worlds which guard and sort of keep these economic interests in place. And the relationship between the two is not a simple linear one. This is something that you get from Gramsci, and this is a sense you get from Ambedkar's thought world as well when he tries to theorize the economy. Now, how does he understand the specificities of the Indian economic order? Because you have peasant production and you have an emergent small industrial production as well in the colonial period. And as we know, Ambedkar's encounter with the world of peasant and industrial production was not simply an intellectual one. It was also something that emerged from his practice, from his attempts to build the Independent Labour Party in the 1930s, and from his attempts to understand the nature of peasant production in one part of India, which is Western Maharashtra, the Konkan region, where you had the anti-court struggle. As I said, the courts were these revenue intermediaries. They were meant to collect revenue from tenants and peasants and convey them to the colonial treasury. In the event, they become extremely powerful and violent agents of the colonial state. Many of them were Brahmins, but not exclusively so. Some of them were Marathas also. And so the anti-court struggle, which had engaged the attention of local activists from the 1920s. And Ambedkar was aware of it, and he writes about these struggles in Vaishrit Bharat much before he wrote of this in Janata. And he makes that struggle central to the politics of the Independent Labour Party in the late 1930s, after 1936. And I think his understanding of peasant economy derives from that, what was going on the ground and how Dalits and the peasants could stand together against the courts. But when it came, and I said this in the last class as well, when it came to the contradictions between Dalits and non-Dalit peasants, that was another matter altogether, that non-Dalit peasants did expect Dalits to carry out customary labor, which is something else that Ambedkar opposes with his Maharvatan legislation. So we went through all of that. Ambedkar, of course, did not theorize from this practice or from what he gathered on the ground about the nature of the peasant economy in India, so to speak. But he was aware that there is something within struggles waged in the peasant economy that could lend itself to a different sort of political formation within which Bahujans and Dalits could at least provisionally struggle together. And he did put out an invitation to major peasant leaders like the phenomenal Swami Sahajananda from the United Provinces, who was a doyen of the All India Kisan Mahasabha, which was initially linked to the Congress, but which became a semi-independent organization and moved further and further left in the 1940s. And Ambedkar did meet with Sahajananda and exchange views with him on whether you could build an independent peasant movement in the Indian context, which would leave out the Indian National Congress. At this moment in history, in the 30s, Swamiji wasn't ready for it, though in the 40s he was ready for it, as the peasant movement gathered strength and resilience on the ground. And at that moment, you see Sahajananda, who was in prison in the 1940s, actually thinking of a leftward shift of the Kisan Sabha itself. But in the 1930s, that did not exist. So Ambedkar's chance of theorizing the peasant economy in terms of something beyond Western Maharashtra, sort of didn't therefore take off in the way that we could have expected it to take off. And of course, his more programmatic resolution of the peasant question comes with the Constituent Assembly debates, with the note that he prepared, States and Minorities, where he calls for a collectivization of agricultural land and so on. Those of you who have read that text know what he has to say. So it sort of went there. But Ambedkar did continue to keep in touch with a number of peasant leaders who were working in particular pockets of Western India, including a Gandhian, Indulal Yagnik, whom he respected highly. So I think he was looking out, being aware, and we know that in the 40s, he did ask for Dalits to sort of move towards land struggles. He did intimate Dada Saheb Gaikwad that this was an important struggle. This was later on taken up by Dada Saheb Gaikwad himself in the 50s and so on. So you do have that centrality that he wished to give the peasant question at this moment in time, in the full awareness that the whole tension over land, which I spoke of last time, when it came to Dalits who were agricultural laborers accessing land, was by no means solved or even fully addressed within the peasant movements. So Ambedkar was aware of these limitations, but he continued to retain an interest in the peasant economy. As far as the industrial class was concerned, industrial class questions were concerned, we know, and I've seen, and I've sort of referred to this in my earlier lectures, he did have a sense of tension with communist organizing in the city of Bombay, in the textile industry, in the textile mills, and that was part of it. But he also had a far more global understanding of industrial economics in the context of colonial India. He did link the micro and the macroeconomic arguments quite well in his own dissertations, but also he was aware that a lot of industrial production in the Indian context, limited as it was, cannot be separated from the sort of decision making that existed at the highest levels of the of political economy in the Indian context, that the interest of Manchester or the British bourgeoisie cannot be so easily separated from the interest of the colonial state. He was very aware of these arguments. And in his own practice, he tried to build as many safeguards for labor to protest its conditions of existence. And as we know, during his tenure as labor member, as also later on, he spoke of industrial production as having to be nationalized in a fundamental sense, that if you are to take further the levels of industrialization in India, the state would have to have a very important role to play, especially in primary production, in the creation of infrastructural industries, including mines, generation of electricity, dams, and so on. That while he did envisage a small role for the private sector, and interestingly, he harkens back to Lenin's position during the new economic policy debates in the Soviet Union, that there is a possibility for private entrepreneurship, but under control. So these were his arguments about the industrial sector. And he connected the two in important ways, because he saw peasant economy as hopelessly inefficient if it has to continue in the manner it has continued, and that consolidation of land holdings and industrialization were the only things that would make for a stable and strong economy. with the state being central to these processes. And as far as Dalits were concerned, he felt industrial production would open up their economic opportunities, would rescue them from caste-based servitude, and that being part of the industrial workforce would instill in them a sense of what it meant to be a worker. And we see this in his address to the railway workers and his address to the laborers' camp, that you will have a realization of yourself as being part of the working class. And all of this is something that he speaks at in several of his writings, and in particularly his addresses to the workers. So this is something that you see. So that's as far as the movement between the peasant economy and the industrial economy is concerned. Now, his attitude towards communist organizing in India, why was that a problem for him? Apart from the more general problems that he gestures towards, that communists do not see that there is no proletarian consciousness, that they are trying to build castles in the air without really understanding that the emergence of the proletarian class simultaneously has to happen along with the movement towards the annihilation of caste and the critique of religion. He sees these as simultaneous movements, not as something that can follow one after the other. That's, of course, by way of a strong foundational critique of the Indian communist movements as they existed in the late 1920s and the 1930s and into the 40s. But I think also he draws on Marx and Lenin to make fairly specific kinds of arguments. For example, could the politically motivated strike be the only means through which you hit at the colonial economy? And he speaks of how Marx did not fetishize the strike, that one cannot confuse Marx's position with that of the syndicalists, by whom he means George Sorel, who trusted in the general strike as a weapon, as a class weapon, and that the laborers had to have a say in how they organized their protest. And therefore, he did not see the communist-run trade unions entirely as organizations of the laboring class. He felt that they were led, in the latter days, he used to refer to them as Brahmin boys. But I think it was not simply their caste origin as such that he objected to, but also the fact that they were not from the laboring classes, and that a party of labor must be led by the laboring classes. And this is an interesting alternative to thinking about the Communist Party as different from, say, the Leninist notion, where the Communist Party is a vanguard, and the vanguard need not necessarily be only from the working classes. It could be from other classes, except that it ought to have a vanguardist perspective. Gramsci had a far more complex position on the vanguardist left party. He also envisaged a central role for the laboring classes in the making of the party, and that the consciousness that he wished the party to possess, what he called the consciousness of being a leading party, a ruling party, which cannot leave out the experiences of the working class. At the same time, the working class had to build itself into being a leader. And Ambedkar would not disagree with that. After all, he wanted the working class to also intellectually raise itself. So these are ways in which we can think of Ambedkar's relationship to the communist trade unions of his time. Now, what was his understanding of the Communist Party itself, or the communists themselves as they existed in India? And here I think we need to step back a bit and take a look at the communist movement in India. And here I'm not going to go through just their understanding of caste or their disinterest in the caste question, or the way they looked at Ambedkar and other anti-caste movements. I think in his introduction to India and communism, Anand Teltunde has done a wonderful job of recounting the sins of commission and omission of the Indian left in this respect. And I don't want to repeat those arguments. I think we can sort of read that text, which I think is a very important part of Anand's work in the recent past. What I wish to do is something different. What was the Indian communist movement, and how did it sort of emerge in the ways that it did during this point in time? And I think that's an important historical thing for us to understand. So let's sort of step back a bit and look at how was socialism understood in India. I think socialism as an ideal very broadly attracted a number of people, not all of whom were necessarily interested in the class question. Like say Tilak. one of the earliest references to socialism is in Kesari in the 19th century. And socialism was also referenced by rationalists in the Tamil context, who were very active from the 1880s and who announced that their bookstore sold socialist literature. So socialism was seen as a broad ethical ideal, which was interested in equality, in distributive justice, but it was not always seen as something linked to the struggles of the working class, broadly within the Indian context. Karl Marx was well known from the early 20th century, but again, Karl Marx and his relationship with the international labor movement was not something that was necessarily known to everybody. In fact, Hardayal, who was in the Ghadar movement, he referred to the Rishi Karl Marx. You know, he talks of Karl Marx as a Rishi. So he was seen as this great philosophical thinker. And in further, as you come into the 20th century, you see that there was some writing available around the 1919s and 20s on Marxism, but not a great deal. If you didn't know English, you wouldn't even have access to those writings. So basically, the understanding of socialism was broad, expansive, not specific, and so on, till almost the early 1920s. And even the writings of men like of Yengde, for example, reflect this. Yengde's early history, Lenin and Gandhi, points to how people weren't even quite clear what the Bolshevik Revolution was all about yet. It wasn't quite clear. And those that were clear, like M.N. Roy and various others who were in the Soviet Union at this time, were not quite clear about the Indian situation. M.N. Roy, interestingly, in 1919, suggests that India is on the brink of a revolution. How? I think the troubles in India of a political nature against the Rowlatt Act, the strikes that were getting to be very common in the Bombay context through the 1920s, all of these make it seem that India is on the brink of an insurrectionary politics, whereas you know very well it wasn't. That Bombay city did not represent India, that the working class that was active in Bombay, Kanpur, Kolkata, and Chennai represented a very small fragment of the Indian working class. But it was possible for someone like M.N. Roy to imagine that you could actually see a working class consciousness develop, and that the feudal order to which he sort of assimilated caste was something that could be attacked and assailed over a period of time. So there was a sense of unreality about these descriptions. In retrospect, we see that. Whereas in India itself, there was a sense of not quite clear sense of what Bolshevism was all about, what Lenin was all about, what was Marx's ideas, and so on. Things became clearer towards the late 1920s and into the 1930s. But still what you find in the Indian left, and I'm not going to get into a long history of the Indian left, its formations and so on. The documents of the Indian Communist Party are available for anyone who wants to read them in archive.org. But it's very evident that the Indian communist movement was still gathering strength, trying to form itself, very much under the watchmanship and the guardianship of the Communist International or the Comintern, and later on under the tutelage of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And therefore, its understanding of the Indian economic, social, and political systems was much mediated by these two organizations, which is the Comintern and the Communist Party of Great Britain, and that whatever independent insights they might have existed, these never really came into fruition, into full flowering. And so when we speak of Ambedkar's understanding of the Indian left, we may have to keep in mind it was a left that was still in process, that was still emergent. But even within that moment of emergence, it did not have a sense of the socio-cultural order of India, that its understanding of caste was very limited. It did not see itself as having to learn from the anti-caste movements, though all the joins of the early left knew the anti-caste movement, whether it was Singaravelu in the Madras presidency, whether it was Dange and Adhikari and others in Bombay. People were very aware. And as I said in my last class, they were very aware of the way caste and class were intertwined, but they did not think it fit to address this understanding of caste and class as it came from the anti-caste movements. And in their longest theoretical statements and historical statements, like what Dange and others put out during the Meerut conspiracy case, when they were all booked for sedition, you will find exactly 4 references to caste, and all those references point to the fact that the caste question, as it is taken up by the depressed classes formations, are reactionary, that their class position is reactionary. So there was no engagement with the kinds of political developments that were happening in Ambedkar's own political organizing, in the organizing of the Periyar movement in southern India and elsewhere in different parts of India. So except for seeing them as reactionary and as imperialist lackeys because they were part of the political process because they participated in the Simon Commission and the roundtable conferences, you don't see any other understanding emerging from within the Indian left. So Ambedkar's anger and annoyance and irritation can be well understood within this context. The other thing that we need to also keep in mind is that across the world, after the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place, but even prior to that, the emergence of socialist parties almost everywhere had also alerted even classic capitalist societies, such as you find in the United States, to rethink the laissez-faire project. So the sort of open, free-for-all market capitalism that you find people endorsing in the 19th century, you don't find that anywhere else in the world. Even in a classic capitalist economy like the United States and in Europe, where you already have people making a case for state intervention. The most classic statements are, of course, coming from places where labor parties are active, like, say, the United Kingdom, where you have, and Suraj mentioned Lasky, Harold Lasky, and an entire range of socialist thinkers who see the possibilities of state reform, of nationalization. The point I'm trying to make is the Leninist model of insurrection and revolution was one amongst many models that was being proposed. And there was a lot of argument and back and forth between different ways of defeating capitalism. And this is important for us to remember today. And also, let's not forget, the Leninist model itself was not premised on the growth of capitalism reaching a crisis, which crisis is then creating the socio-political and economic conditions for socialist insurrection. Marx himself did not think that that was a model that would work for all contexts. We know that in his conversation with the Russians. We also know that from his last writings, all of which are now available for public scrutiny with detailed notes and annotations. So the idea that you have to pass through the capitalist stage to become socialist was not basically something that Marx himself would have endorsed. And Lenin's revolution was largely a political revolution, as was Mao's revolution, with the addition that Mao looks into the peasant question in great detail. So the point I'm trying to make is that there was no single orthodoxy that was available in the 1930s. In fact, there were many positions. And I think it's important for us to keep this in mind because Ambedkar is perhaps aware of this fact in ways that we don't always give him credit for. He certainly was aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union, but he was also aware that perhaps there was no one path to socialism. And while he may not have followed, or perhaps he did, and we don't know about it, developments in China, but he was becoming increasingly convinced that a socialist model of economic justice was eminently desirable. Now, as to who would achieve the making of the worker state is something that he thinks through. He thinks that a party fashioned like the Labour Party in Britain, but with this understanding of the need to annihilate and caste in the Indian context might do that work. He perhaps had a sense of that. Now, whether that should be done through insurrectionary means, through acts of revolution, or whether that could come through democratic persuasion, through the making of a worker state, through electoral democracy. These are all questions that he puts out on the table. And he may not have addressed them in clear-cut terms because there were no clear-cut answers across the world at this point in time. So now I want to sort of therefore come to that one text where it might seem he had clear-cut answers before I end this lecture. And I think that text is a fascinating text. And it also prepares us for what Ambedkar would do in the Buddha and his Dhamma. This is, of course, Karl Marx or Buddha a text that he wrote, perhaps one of his last writings. Karl Marx of Buddha is a very interesting text in many ways. It has its precursors. He also spoke something along the same lines at the World Buddhist Conference in Nepal just a few weeks before his conversion. He also speaks the same content in his, part of the content is there in his conversion speech. But Karl Marx of Buddha is interesting because what Ambedkar is trying to do is to insist on the importance of the socialist understanding of economic justice, but not necessarily the socialist understanding of politics. This is something he makes clear. His understanding of Karl Marx and what he thinks is valuable about Karl Marx, he doesn't engage deeply enough with Karl Marx's economic arguments, except to say that capitalism might not come into crisis as we imagine and so on, but he leaves that out. But what he retains as central from Karl Marx, that there is a transformative role for philosophy to play in preparing the ground for socialism, that the class struggle is important and the class struggle has to be necessarily seen as a struggle against private property, that private property leads to expropriation of the workers, and that's a situation that cannot be countenanced and it has to be struggled against. Now, how you would struggle against it, through what means, that is the question where he differs, he argues with the Marxists, and then he goes into great length discussing means and ends in Karl Marx of Buddha. He says that proletarian dictatorship is a desirable end, and perhaps you would need to use militant means, perhaps even violent means to secure that end. But having secured that end, why would you want to retain those means? And I think he has the Soviet state in mind. He is a critique of the lack of democracy in the Soviet state and of the sort of Stalinist model that had evolved by this time. And I think his critique is an ethical critique as well as a political critique, because as an ethical critique, what he wants us to understand is if you use violence as a means to secure a certain end, that violence also destroys various other ends that are important. In this case, political liberty. And then at some point, you would have to go back and reinstate political liberty. So he's making a case for a use of militant means through thinking of militancy itself in ways that are interesting. He talks of force as energy and as force as violence, and how would you move from force as violence to force as energy. And here he thinks there's a role for a certain sort of democratic persuasive politics, but that democratic persuasive politics cannot be only left to the terrain of parliamentary democracy. That's an argument that has to be made continuously in the terrain of society and the civil order. And here is where he envisages a role for Buddhism. And by Buddhism, he means an entire ethical and political outlook, which of course he discusses at length in Buddha and his Dhamma, which is not simply an instrumental use of Buddhism, but actually that Buddhism affords you a worldview through which you can re-understand socialism. So he submits socialism to the Buddhist lens, and he draws on the Mahanidana Sutta to do it, and we'll see exactly how he does that when we look at Buddha and his Dhamma. But basically that the ethical world of Buddhism, which is against property, which is against avarice, should serve us to develop ways of coming to terms with possession and private property. And here is where he envisages a role for the Sangha, because he thinks the Sangha, the way he understands the Sangha, which is very different from the Sanghas that had evolved under Theravada Buddhism in Burma and in Sri Lanka. He basically sees the Sangha as a political organization, which must not sit back in the monastery, which must be out there amongst the people, preaching, arguing, persuading. And I think he didn't have time. His, sadly, fate and history didn't leave us or him with time to understand what else he would have expected a Sangha-like organization to do. But I would like to sort of see it as the very antithesis of what intellectual organizations or the intellectual class had done in India until that time, and perhaps does even now. And as we know, Ambedkar refused to consider Brahmins as an intellectual class. He called them an educated class who had often used their education and their powers of argument to defer change, to recoup whatever change that had taken place within a narrative that justified the caste order, justified Brahmanism, justified untouchability. This is what he narrates to us in the triumph of Brahmanism, and I won't go into that. But I think he also sees a Sangha-like organization as being responsible for a different sort of intellectual and ethical life, along with the worker state, which is to be reinstated, which is to be instated, one could safely say, through parliamentary democracy. But at the same time, there might be room for violence. Now, who would be the agents of that violence or militancy? Ambedkar doesn't quite specify any of these things. But I think he leaves us with enough in his thought world to think of the political, ethical model, the socio-economic model that he thinks is an alternative to both caste untouchability model and to the capitalist model. So that is something that he charges us to think about. A worker state persuaded into democracy by a Sangha-like organization. What would you call that? Is it socialism? Is it Fabian socialism? Is it Buddhism? I don't know if any of these words accurately capture the new directions into which he was pushing us, wanting all of us to think about, and charging Dalits with a special role as the proletarians, as the ideal proletarians, as those who had nothing to lose from annihilating caste, from ending untouchability, and of charging Dalits with setting perhaps an example through their conversion to Buddhism. So these are all open-ended ideas I will leave you with, and time for questions. Thank you for this.